You keep saying you're thinking it through. You're not. You're reacting. You feel something, and your mind rushes to justify it, not to understand it, to protect it. That's the pattern. A feeling appears, you follow it, then you build a reason around it so it feels like a decision. It isn't. It's a reaction that you refuse to question. You call it intuition. You call it instinct. You call it being honest with yourself. But most of the time, it's just an unfiltered response to discomfort. You don't like how something feels, so you move away from it. You don't want to sit with uncertainty, so you rush into a choice. You don't want tension, so you resolve it quickly. And every time you do that, you reinforce the same structure. Emotion first, action second, justification last. That's not control, that's submission. You're not deciding, you're being moved. And because it happens internally, you don't question it. There's no external pressure forcing you. It feels like it comes from you, so you trust it. That's where the mistake is. Not every internal signal deserves to be followed. Some are just reactions to discomfort. Some are habits that formed over time. Some are patterns you've repeated so often that they feel natural. But natural doesn't mean correct. It just means familiar. You feel anxious and you avoid. You feel uncertain and you delay. You feel pressure and you rush. You feel doubt and you step back. You don't examine the feeling. You obey it. That's the problem. Because feelings are immediate. They're fast. They don't wait. They don't analyze. They push. And if you've trained yourself to respond to every push, you lose the ability to choose. You think you're making decisions, but you're just responding faster than you can observe. You never create space. And without space, there's no control. Something happens. You feel it. You act. There's no interruption, no pause, no separation between what you experience and what you do. That's where everything breaks, because control doesn't exist in action. It exists before it, in the moment where you decide whether to act at all. You don't use that moment. You skip it. You go straight from feeling to doing. And over time, that becomes your default. You don't question your reactions. You trust them. You assume they're valid because they feel real, but intensity doesn't equal accuracy. Just because something feels strong doesn't mean it's right. It just means it's loud, and you've been trained to listen to whatever is loud, not whatever is correct. That's why your decisions feel inconsistent, because they are. They're based on whatever you feel in the moment, and moments change. Your internal state shifts constantly. What feels right now won't feel the same in an hour, but the action you take based on that feeling stays. You make a decision in a temporary state, and then you deal with permanent consequences. That's instability, not because you lack intelligence, because you don't separate feeling from action. You treat them as one. You experience something, and you immediately turn it into behavior. That removes your ability to evaluate, to step back, to see what's actually happening. You don't observe your emotions, you become them. You don't say, "This is what I'm feeling." You say, "This is what I should do." That's the confusion. A feeling is information, not instruction, but you've been treating it like a command, and every time you follow it without question, you make that pattern stronger. You reduce your ability to resist it. You make it automatic. You remove yourself from the process. That's how you lose control. Not all at once, gradually, through repetition. You respond the same way enough times, and it becomes your default. Not because it's effective, because it's familiar. You stop thinking about it. You stop questioning it. You just follow it. And then you look at the outcome and wonder why nothing changes. But nothing changes because your response doesn't. You feel the same things. You react the same way. You create the same results. And then you try to fix it by thinking more, by analyzing more, by adding more information. But the issue isn't what you know, it's what you do in the moment. And in the moment, you're not choosing, you're reacting. You don't need more strategies. You need interruption, a break in the pattern, a pause between feeling and action. That's where control exists. Not in suppressing emotion, not in eliminating it. In delaying your response to it, you feel something, and instead of acting, you hold it. You don't immediately move. You don't immediately decide. You let it exist without turning it into behavior. That's unfamiliar, because you're used to immediate resolution. You want to reduce discomfort quickly. You want to remove tension. But that tension is where your control is. If you remove it too fast, you remove your ability to choose. You go back to reaction. You stay in the same loop. You keep making the same decisions, and you keep getting the same results. You don't need to change your emotions. You need to change your relationship with them. Stop treating them as commands. Start treating them as signals, something to observe, not something to follow. You don't move because you feel something. You move because you decide. That distinction is what separates reaction from control. And right now, you don't have that distinction. You feel, you act, you justify, and then you repeat. That's the cycle. And until you interrupt it, nothing changes. Not your behavior, not your outcomes, not your direction. You stay where you are. Not because you can't move, because you're always moving in response to something else. You never hold your position long enough to choose your direction. That's what needs to change, not your emotions, your response to them. You don't eliminate what you feel. You stop letting it decide for you. You don't stop feeling. That was never the objective. The feeling still comes. The pressure still rises. The impulse still appears. What changes is what you do next. Before there was no separation. You felt something and you moved with it. Now there's a gap, small, but enough to see what's happening instead of becoming it. That's where everything begins to shift. You start noticing how fast your reactions used to be, how quickly your body would tense, how fast your mind would create a direction, not because it was right, because it was immediate. You weren't choosing. You were responding to speed, to intensity, to whatever appeared first. Now you slow that down. Not by force. By refusing to follow the first signal, you feel it and you hold it. You don't suppress it. You don't ignore it. You don't try to change it. You just don't act on it. That's the difference. And it feels unnatural because you've trained yourself to resolve tension immediately, to remove discomfort as fast as possible. But that discomfort is not the problem. Your reaction to it is. You feel uncertainty. Your instinct is to escape it. You feel pressure. Your instinct is to act quickly. You feel doubt. Your instinct is to withdraw. None of those are decisions. They're responses. And they happen before you think. That's why you trust them. Because they feel automatic. But automatic doesn't mean accurate. It just means practiced. You've practiced reacting for so long that it feels like instinct. But instinct can be wrong. Especially when it's built on repetition instead of evaluation. You don't question your first reaction, you assume it's valid. And that assumption keeps you trapped, because your first reaction is not based on clarity, it's based on protection. Protection from discomfort, from uncertainty, from anything that forces you to stay still longer than you're used to. That's why it pushes you to move, to decide quickly, to escape the moment. But that escape removes your control. You leave the decision before you've examined it. You act before you understand, and then you deal with the result. That's the cycle. Feel, react, justify, repeat. Now that cycle starts to break. Not because you stopped feeling, because you stopped obeying. You feel something, and instead of moving, you stay. That's it. No immediate action, no immediate resolution, just presence. And in that presence, something becomes visible. The difference between the feeling and the situation. Before, they were the same. You felt something and you assumed it reflected reality. Now you see the separation. The feeling is internal. The situation is external. They don't have to match. You can feel pressure in a situation that doesn't require urgency. You can feel doubt in a situation that requires action. You can feel discomfort in a situation that needs patience. Your internal state is not always aligned with what's required. And if you act based on it, you create misalignment. You move in the wrong direction, not because you chose it, because you reacted to how you felt. That's what you start to correct. You don't eliminate the feeling. You remove its authority. It no longer decides, it informs. That's a different role. It gives you data, but it doesn't give you direction. You decide that, and that decision doesn't come instantly. It comes after observation, after you've allowed the initial reaction to settle, after you've seen it clearly, not while you're inside it. That's what changes your behavior. You stop making decisions at the peak of emotion. You wait. Not long, just enough. Enough for the intensity to drop. Enough for the noise to reduce. Enough for you to see what remains when the reaction passes. That's where clarity exists, not in the first moment. In what's left after it, most people never reach that point. They act too fast. They respond before the reaction fades. They make decisions in a temporary state, and then they deal with permanent consequences. You don't do that anymore. You delay, not out of hesitation, out of control. You don't need to resolve everything immediately. You don't need to act on every impulse. You don't need to answer every internal push. You let it exist without interference. And that creates stability, because now your actions are not tied to fluctuation. They're tied to decision. You decide once and you follow through, not because you feel like it, because you chose it. That's consistency. Not doing something repeatedly because it feels right, doing it because you committed to it, regardless of how you feel. That's where most people fail. They rely on alignment between feeling and action. They act when they feel motivated. They stop when they don't. They move when it's easy. They hesitate when it's not. Their behavior is tied to their internal state, and their internal state is unstable, so their actions are unstable. You remove that connection. You act based on decision, not emotion. Emotion still exists, but it doesn't control behavior. You feel resistance. You continue. You feel doubt. You stay. You feel discomfort. You hold your position. That's not suppression. That's control. You're not ignoring what you feel. You're choosing not to let it dictate your direction. That's the distinction, and that distinction builds something most people never develop. Reliability. You become reliable to yourself. You decide something, and you follow it. You don't renegotiate based on mood. You don't adjust based on pressure. You don't abandon based on discomfort. You execute. That's rare, because it requires separation between what you feel and what you do. Most people never create that separation. They merge the two. They become their reactions. You don't. You observe them. You let them pass. And then you move. That's where control exists. Not in the absence of emotion. In the ability to act independently of it. That's what changes your outcomes. Not instantly, gradually. Because now your actions are consistent. They don't fluctuate with your internal state. They follow your decisions. And decisions, when repeated, create direction. Direction, when sustained, creates progress, not fast, not dramatic, stable. And stability is what you've been missing, not knowledge, not ability, control, over the moment before you act. That's where everything begins, and that's where most people lose it. You don't anymore.